Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our evening with the Transport Planning Bursary finalists for 2021. We're really delighted to welcome you here this evening. My name's Jo Ward. I'm an ex-Transport Planning Society board member, and it's my pleasure to organise the Bursary competition for the Transport Planning Society. Last year's competition, which was entitled Scenario Planning, How Can Transport Planners Best Plan for the New Normal, attracted some fantastic entries. And we've got our three finalists with you tonight who are going to present their papers, and then hopefully we're going to have some kind of engaging discussion about what they've got to say about how they think we can best plan for the new normal. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce them, but I'm going to ask you and say that if you've got any comments or any questions that you want to make throughout the evening, please put them in the chat. Please say hello and mention where you are, and just feel part of the conversation. So please do join in. Yeah, great to see you, everybody. So I've got three wonderful people to introduce you to tonight. I probably won't give them a full introduction in this bit because I'm sure they'll introduce themselves as part of their presentation, but I just want to say hello to Julia, Lucy and Leonie and say thank you so much for being bursary finalists from last year, and thank you so much for giving up your time this evening to present your papers. We're really looking forward to hearing your work again, and I know our audience are in for a fantastic evening because I've heard you present on these topics before. So without further ado, Julia, the floor is yours. We're really looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Great, I'll just share my screen, hang on. Is that sharing my screen and not Teams?
Yeah, we can see your screen. Thanks, Julia.
Okay, so hello, I'm Julia Coonan. I'm a transport planner at PJA. Unlike the other two finalists that you're going to hear from tonight, I actually interpreted the theme of the essay competition slightly differently. And I've chosen one scenario which I considered to be our new normal, and I've looked at how transport planners could best plan for enabling that new normal. So the title of my paper was The Great British Staycation, Improving Public Transport and Cycling Access to Popular Tourist Destinations. I thought it'd be good to share this quick video of the moment in summer 2021 when I thought, like, wow, why do we as transport planners primarily focus on commuting trips when there's clearly, you know, another issue here of leisure that needs to be looked at in more detail. I was on a long distance bike trip and I was so excited because our route went through the village of Stow on the Wold in the Cotswolds, and I'd never been there before. But to be honest, I was really disappointed. As you can tell from the video, the famous beautiful market square was essentially a giant car park, and everyone else bar us having A, arrived by car, and B, seemingly not noticed that the cars were absolutely ruining the streetscape. Ooh, again. So this is the structure of my presentation. I'm first going to give a quick introduction to what I considered the new normal to be, and provide a summary of why we as transport planners should care about this issue. I'm going to give an outline of my methodology of the research for the paper before moving on to talking about the main findings and give a quick summary of the recommendations for how I think transport planners can respond to this new challenge. So first, to talk about my interpretation of the new normal, obviously it's going to do with cycling. I chose to look at the intersection of A, the increase in the popularity of the UK staycation, in this instance defined as a domestic holiday, not one where you don't leave your house, and B, the rise of leisure cycling. So both staycations and leisure cycling were affected positively by the COVID-19 pandemic, partly due to travel restrictions abroad and also thanks to the periods of low traffic during lockdowns, which encouraged a wider range of people to get out and try cycling. In fact, I think research showed that leisure cycling was peaking at 300% increase on weekends compared to pre-COVID levels. Obviously, it's been over a year since I presented this paper. I haven't managed to gather any data this summer to corroborate whether I thought this new normal was going to continue, but anecdotally, I would say it has. I mean, I'm sure everyone on this webinar might have struggled to book accommodation and or catch a train or, you know, been stuck in traffic this summer. I think staycations are very much here to stay. So the issue that my paper discussed is, you know, why is it so difficult to combine both these activities, UK staycations and leisure cycling? there's a myriad of challenges that I kind of think are getting in the way. And number one, it's accessing stations by bike, booking bikes onto the train, actually managing to use the bike spaces provided on trains, a lack of safe connected routes at your destination, and obviously the cost of public transport and strikes, but strikes weren't so much of a thing when I did this presentation the first time. The result is that often cycling is viewed as kind of a one-off holiday activity rather than a default transport mode for accessing all other holiday activities. But why should we care about this issue? I've summarised why it's an important issue to look at into 3 reasons. Firstly, staycations are generally considered the sustainable choice of holiday, but that's mostly based on the idea that the only unsustainable aspect of the holiday are the emissions associated with flying there. Actually, given that domestic transport is responsible for 28% of our emissions, any reductions elsewhere in utility trips is going to be kind of cancelled out by this increase in leisure trips in the UK. To give an example of the scale of the problem, the latest available pre-COVID data from the Lake District National Park showed that over 80% of the annual 20 million visitors the Lake District arrived by car. It's also important to remember that it's not spread linearly across the year. They're really concentrated on a few months and peak weekends, further exacerbating the problem. The next issue is that despite recent shifts to turn the hierarchical pyramid around and focus on walking, cycling and public transport, the committed investment and action in sustainable modes has still been quite slow and largely focused on short-term small-scale measures. Obviously, since I researched this paper, Active Travel England has finally started up. But, sorry, I'm skipping pages here. Active Travel England's finally started up, but as this is still a new organisation, we're obviously yet to see any long-term results from it, but hopefully they'll be promising. And finally, a lot of the models we use to provide evidence for projects are centred on the commuter, I think as I mentioned earlier, which has historically always been given a higher economic value, which is why we focus on it. Potentially that means we're missing a huge chunk of the kind of travel market by not having the right tools to assess leisure trips. So to learn more about these issues, I conducted interviews and undertook a literature review. In order to choose who to interview, I thought about the whole journey of a cycling staycation and what kinds of people would be good to kind of tap into along the journey, as it were. And in the end, I was able to speak to some really great people: a sustainable travel planner at the Lake District National Park, transport planners with specialisms in walking and cycling at Sustrans, Cycling UK, a Cycle Rail Partnership Advisory Group, and excitingly, the project manager for ScotRail's Highland Explorer service, which I'll be talking about in a minute. To provide consistency in my interviews, I asked questions along a similar theme, but not the exact same question, because obviously we wanted to let the conversation flow. And the themes were these that are shown on the screen. So what's the current situation in the UK with staycations and cycling? What's needed to bridge that gap to get to the aspirational situation? What does that particular person I interviewed think about the role of infrastructure, policy and data in kind of getting to that aspiration, and also what they think is more important in terms of kind of carrot versus stick measures in reaching that aspiration. So these next few slides look at a few key themes come out of the interviews, which then formed the bulk of the analysis of the paper. So talking about the current situation in the interviews really highlighted the important role that pilot schemes play, particularly kind of in recent years. They provide a great opportunity to assess if something does, or importantly, that it doesn't work, and how pilot schemes can then be expanded to play a larger role in kind of societal behaviour and transport change. So the first case study I looked at was a pilot scheme for travelling to your destination via public transport and cycling. The ScotRail Highland Explorer, which is shown in this photo on screen, runs from Glasgow to Oban and opened for the first time in summer 2021. The project actually kicked off in 2017 following a request from Transport Scotland to investigate options for improved cycle storage on trains. The result was an updated carriage adapted from excess rolling stock, which provides 20 dedicated bike spaces, including room for non-standard bikes, and there's electric bike charging points as well. The carriage isn't included in every service, but it runs at key times of the day, which have been identified as popular times people to kind of want to bring bikes with them, and particularly at weekends. I was really hoping to go on one this summer, but to be honest, I'm not really sure summer went this year. The next case study looks at travelling at your destination by public transport. So like ScotRail in summer 2021, a temporary car park and shuttle bus began operating in the Wasdale Valley in the Lake District National Park. It's a really popular tourist destination, and it provides access to Scafell Pike. It was implemented kind of in response to high volumes of traffic on really quite unsuitable roads for those levels of traffic, particularly in summers of 2020 and early 2021. There's reports in the news about gridlock and illegal parking and causing issues to emergency service vehicles. So this was kind of the implemented in response to it. It ran throughout the summer period at 30-minute intervals. And I think it was technically free, but they kind of requested a suggested fee of £2 per person to help it to run. And the final case study looks at travelling at your destination by active travel. So in early 2021, the Keswick to Threlkeld railway trail reopened for the first time since 2015. It was destroyed by Storm Desmond in 2015. It's a 5-kilometre pedestrian and cycle kind of shared use route, and it's been resurfaced, and it features a number of upgrades compared to the previous route. And the upgrades are aimed at incorporating best practice and creating a safe, inclusive route with kind of lighting, better wayfinding, more seating. It forms part of the National Cycle Network now, and it's also part of the kind of signposted coast-to-coast route, so it was expected to be quite well used. Unlike the other two examples, the nature of the pilot aspect of the scheme is the use of best practice on the leisure route, which previously, obviously, it can't really be achieved on a temporary basis, so they've kind of thrown everything at this route with the kind of hopes to build new things like this in the future. Initial data from all three of those pilot schemes showed really positive trends in uptake or kind of positive feedback. So from that, the next logical step then would be to use the performance of those pilot schemes as an evidence-based to implement similar measures elsewhere. So 3 interlinked trends were highlighted through the interviews to help kind of bridge this gap from pilot schemes to widespread. And they were kind of issues about funding, issues about kind of data capture, and also policy change. I'm going to discuss those trends in relation to how they kind of link to each case study. So the first theme to be highlighted as an issue in my discussions was data capture. And an example of kind of bridging the gap here can be seen with the ScotRail Highland Explorer project. When I spoke to the project manager, he was saying they have really great aspirations in terms of bridging the gap for data capture, and they already collect kind of soft data from conductors, including bike numbers and kind of boarding and lighting. But he said that they're really planning to capture data over longer term, including an assessment of kind of the economic impact of this new service on the wider area in terms of leisure and tourism. This is like particularly pertinent. I think Active Travel England are hoping to kind of do the same. So this is hopefully a really good example. Next, on the issue of funding, an essential factor in implementing more services and to help cement the role of a new service in the community is funding, but often it's quite short-lived, and then the process has to kind of happen all over again. So in the Lake District, they had a large pot of funding in 2010, 2011, but then they had nothing for a few years, and so those great services they might have implemented then just fell by the wayside. However, the Wasdale shuttle bus was so popular and had such great feedback in 2021, the Lake District were able to rerun it in 2022 with using funding they'd obtained. The final issue is policy change, which is important because the justification of new schemes and measures typically hinges on a suitable economic case being presented that provides good value for money. However, it's difficult to accurately predict future demand for active travel schemes aimed at leisure cycling. Using the Keswick to Threlkeld railway path as an example, they found it really difficult to estimate the kind of suppressed demand for the route since it had been destroyed by the storm, despite it previously existing. And actually, the numbers of people using the route over the first 8 months, I think it was 250,000, which was far exceeding the pre-opening forecast. The reason it's difficult to predict is kind of twofold. Firstly, the focus on commuting over leisure, as I mentioned before, and secondly, the kind of lack of toolkits that are appropriately designed for rural settings. So as great as the LTM 120 and local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, LCWIPs, are really great toolkits, but often they kind of fall short if they're not applied to an urban project. Another policy issue, kind of unrelated to the case study, is that whilst there are cycle parking standards for new hotels or new developments, there are no cycle parking standards for a change of use or change of use to a holiday let, which is quite a largely unregulated practice, or beaches or key holiday destinations. So as a result, a lot of people simply wouldn't be able to bring a bike because that kind of infrastructure isn't there because there isn't the policy backing for it to be there. So based on the evidence out in the paper, the following recommendations were kind of my suggestions for how transport planners can contribute to bridging the gap between aspirational and actual, and help target kind of a modal shift increase in the number of people being able to go on staycation with sustainable transport options. So firstly, data. I think we should have improved data capture, including baseline and future usage numbers. and a wider quantitative and qualitative assessment of local economic benefits, and improved methods of collaboration and data sharing. ScotRail said that loads of other train operating companies have since approached them and asked them to share kind of how they did it and the outcome as well. So hopefully we'll see that kind of spreading across more train operating companies in the future. The second recommendation theme is policy. We need to lobby governments and train operating companies to mandate or enable the environment for kind of policy change regarding bike facilities on trains. The ScotRail project manager said that this was the catalyst behind getting the project started, as kind of Transport Scotland enabled that environment. I mistakenly thought it was just COVID and they thought it'd be a great idea, but actually it kind of been in the running for a much longer time. We also need integrated policy relating to the provision of active travel infrastructure, so providing cycle parking at tourist hotspots and tourist accommodation. And then on the infrastructure point, we need to improve infrastructure between kind of the tourists' home and their end destination, including bike facilities on trains, reworking the booking system so you can book your bike alongside a train ticket instead of kind of the current method, which is Twitter, Facebook, or, sometimes it's really difficult to work out how to book your bike. We need to identify routes and services which would benefit the most from the best practice cycle rail infrastructure. I think it's really important to stress that I don't think it's necessary to have amazing best practice infrastructure on every service. Obviously, some it just isn't possible or feasible, but we need to identify those key services which would best transport people by foot and cycle, and that probably be Friday evenings, Sunday evenings, typically times that necessarily aren't seen as a priority for travel, but are really key leisure times. I also think we should improve the infrastructure at tourist destinations to make cycling a mode of transport, not just a holiday activity. For example, the provision of like an e-bike network and a network of kind of safe cycle routes for all abilities and not just competent road cyclists. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that active travel trips can't substitute every trip for everyone, and therefore we need an integrated network of sustainable multimodal travel options, park and ride, park and cycle solutions. And the final point is travel planning. I think we should investigate the role of travel planning to increase uptake kind of once infrastructure is improved. It's, sometimes it's chicken and egg situation with what should come first, but we can't exactly tell everyone to get on the bikes, get their bikes on the train when that literally is not the capacity for more than 6 people to do so. Also, travel planning is currently targeted kind of at train stations. You go to a station and it says you should travel by train, but you're already there. We kind of need to capture the consumer before they book a trip. So to summarise, evidently there's no one-size-fits-all approach to encouraging people to travel via sustainable modes but on a UK staycation. I think transport planners are faced with the dilemma of, firstly, how to encourage people to use routes without appropriate infrastructure, and at the same time, how can we justify the provision of new infrastructure when there's seemingly no demand for it? My paper investigated that issue in a bit more detail and made that short series of recommendations on what we can do as transport planners to kind of bridge the gap. But I think ultimately, the aim is to encourage improvements in mode shifts at a faster rate than the UK has been experiencing over the last few decades, and capitalising on that historic and growing demand for UK staycations and the rise of leisure cycling that we've seen since 2020. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Julia, thank you so much for your presentation. It's just, I have heard it before, but as you said, it's quite a long time ago since last January. We were just talking before, wasn't it? But it's such an interesting topic. I really liked the bit that you picked up on in terms of active travel can't be the solution for everybody. And my team at work are sick of hearing my kind of strap line of appropriate modes for appropriate journeys, but I'm going to use that for the transport strategy I'm writing. I don't think that's any secret. I think it's we've kind of got to look at it in that holistic kind of way, haven't we? Because different people need different things and are going to be confident about different things. And some of it is trying it and just seeing which bits you can do. So I really, really liked that piece. And I should just say to our audience now, all of the papers that you're seeing presented tonight are available on the Transport Planning Society website. They've all been published there. So if you want to go and have more of a read or more time to digest what you're being told this evening, that's a really good place to look. So Julia, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because I'm going to ask the same questions of each of the Bursarians at the end of their presentation. And firstly, I wanted to ask you, did you enjoy the process of being part of the bursary competition?
Yeah, I definitely did. Obviously, when you work at a consultancy, sometimes you can be really interested by something, but you don't necessarily have the time or or funding to explore it in more detail. And I obviously am a keen cyclist, as you can tell from the presentations and pictures in it. But as you said, I acknowledge it's not for everyone, but we need that modal shift. And so I was excited to be kind of given the opportunity to explore it in a bit more detail and do some reading and interview people. I knew it actually made some good connections as well. I've since spoken to a few people I've interviewed again in work matters. So actually it was a really good process.
That's music to my ears, so thank you for that. And then I was just going to say, because some people, we've launched our competition for this year. We've got 5 finalists, so we're going to be looking at where buses fit into this. So we're looking at buses this time. But I just wondered if you had any words of advice for anybody who was entering this year or thinking of entering in another year, anything they might think about.
I think in terms of people who might enter in the future, obviously it was a great opportunity. Particularly, I'm also doing a master's in transport planning, but if you don't want to go that far and dedicate a lot more of your time to kind of study and things, then this is a really great opportunity. And just kind of, I did email a lot of train operating companies, and ScotRail was actually the only one who got back to me. And initially I was a bit scared of kind of putting myself out there and asking, because they're big companies and things, but I think just kind of, you have to email everyone and ask for interviews, or you're not going to get the opportunity to speak to anyone. So
fantastic. Thank you so much. And I know we're going to see you again a little bit later when everybody else has had a chance to present. So Julia, thank you very much. And if we were in a real room, everybody would be clapping at this point. So just take that as kind of audience participation. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. So everybody, moving on, our next presenter, Lucy, the floor is yours.
Hiya, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that?
We can see your screen.
Right. Okay, cool. So hi everyone, I'm Lucy Prismore and I am a senior transport planner working at Oxfordshire County Council. So I'm just going to run through my presentation that I submitted as part of the Bursary competition. So I kept the same title as what we were given, but I really was looking at it from an active travel perspective. So just to run through the presentation, so I'll just give a very quick introduction to the topic. I'll then set out the importance of the research, run through the aims and objectives, a quick review of the literature, and then I'll set out the methodology approach, and then I'll present to you the active travel toolkit, which is like the main part of my research, and then a little bit on the data presentation and analysis, and then a quick conclusion. So before I actually started doing my research, I've never come across scenario planning before. So it was a bit of a learning curve for me. So for those of you that don't know what it is, scenario planning is an approach used to plan for future uncertain scenarios. It helps with decision making. You can use it as a way of testing policies and interventions. And there's a lot of kind of examples out there of how it's been used across different industries. And I looked at why there is actually this uncertainty. And of course, at the time of doing the bursary, the COVID pandemic was much more of a bigger thing. And there's all this unknown about how people are going to travel in the future. But I was also very keen at looking at participation in active travel levels, specifically in relation to like social technology, the economy, the environment, and like the whole political factors. And that's what I touched on quite a lot in my research paper. And I chose active travel because I'm generally interested in cycling and walking and wheeling, and I've got a bit of project experience. So that's kind of where or why I chose to focus on active travel. And also because there was this huge amount of investment coming from central government. So it seemed to be like the new craze in transport planning. And the importance of the topic, well, there clearly is a challenge around uncertainties changing within transport, and the COVID-19 pandemic is just a classic example of that. And there is this need to maintain and increase levels of active travel, because we've got our gear change document, which sets out the government's aim to actually double cycling and increase walking by 2025. So my objectives are on the left-hand side. So I was looking at trying to find out what the most uncertain variables were in participation of active travel. How can we as transport planners remain flexible to change? And how can the use of toolkits actually help transport planners plan? And the overall aim of my research was actually to create this active travel toolkit and really give people a list of interventions and policies that you can actually use to implement against certain, uncertain scenarios. And they were all aimed at encouraging active travel participation. So my literature review, I looked at the whole need for scenario planning, and clearly there is this uncertainty about how transport is going to evolve in the future. And I found that, there was already a level of uncertainty before COVID-19 pandemic, and that only just made it worse, essentially. So, it's really key that scenario planning is considered, because it really does help transport planners with decision making, and ultimately that's what we are doing day in, day out, is making decisions. So I chose to actually create some scenarios, and there's different approaches that you can use, and the 2x2 approach is one of them. And essentially this just sets out the 5 steps that you'd go through. So the first step is identifying the driving forces. So basically, this is all in the context of active travel. So what I did is I used a STEEP framework, and you might have heard of it before, or in a slight different acronym. But it's those social, technological, economical, environmental, and political, what I mentioned earlier. And that this framework I've basically used to categorize these drivers. So then the second step was actually clustering these driving forces. And it does look a bit of a mess on the screen, but essentially I've got those driving forces at the top here. And then what I've done is I've linked below the driving forces, you've got the links. So you can kind of understand from that which ones have the most links, and therefore which ones have the most impact, and which ones are potentially the most uncertain. So then what I did with that is plotted it on this XY chart. So you got impact and uncertainty. Basically, the result of that was that political agenda and public interest were considered to be the most impactful, most uncertain clusters. But it's important to mention that actually every cluster has some level of uncertainty. So then what I did is I stuck those 2 most impactful and most uncertain clusters on an XY axis. And then I started to create my 4 scenarios. So basically, it's kind of self-explanatory. You can see what it is on the screen, but it's really trying to get a bit more kind of context around what that scenario could look like. And it is subjective, because someone might see this and they might think, oh no, I think it could be something a bit different instead. But ultimately, these are the 4 scenarios that I came up with. And as part of the literature review, the next thing I did was actually looked at what existing toolkits there are within scenario planning already. And as transport planners in the audience, you may have seen those in the orange boxes. But ultimately, these toolkits actually already offer example scenarios or recommended scenarios that you can use as a way of testing your interventions. And the process that they used in terms of developing the scenarios is actually follows the same or very similar STEEP framework. And that just goes to show that there is this uncertainty across all kind of factors within transport. But the key thing is none of these toolkits actually offered you with specific active travel interventions that are recommended for a certain scenario. It's more the other way around, where you may have your intervention and then you will use one of these toolkits as a way of testing it. So I kind of found that was the gap. But in terms of my methodology, I did a bit of primary and secondary research. So the interventions within the toolkit, they kind of came from my personal experience, but also through other people's experiences as part of the survey responses. So my survey was sent to 50 practitioners. I asked them 11 questions, and basically I was trying to understand what their view was on with regards to uncertainty within active travel, whether they've used a toolkit before, what they thought of my active travel toolkit. And that kind of was a way of me testing my toolkit and understanding whether, you know, is it actually useful for decision makers when planning for uncertainty. And so as part of the secondary research, essentially I was just looking at establishing key trends, and also within the toolkit I've got case study examples of where these interventions have actually been used before. And now I will just, that link doesn't work, so I'll go to the active travel toolkit. So this is just a front page of how you use the toolkit, but essentially this is what the toolkit's like. It's just a pool of interventions and policies that you can use, and it's all categorized in different categories. So the way you would use the toolkit is you've got the scenarios at the top. So those 4 that I developed before. So you would select your scenario. You would then choose your intervention type. So if you wanted to implement some physical infrastructure, you would select that box. And then within that, you've got things like cycle lanes and footways, network management, just scroll down here, street furniture, parking, and there's just quite a relatively extensive list of different interventions you could use. And essentially, I've crossed out or marked where each of these interventions could be applied as part of one of these scenarios. So ultimately, that's how it works. But going back to the presentation, so I'm just going to run through this very quickly. But in terms of the data analysis from my surveys, 89% of people actually agreed that there was this need to plan for uncertainty. And these are kind of the most important variables that people think are important in encouraging active travel. And this was kind of similar to what I was kind of getting out of my research. So it was good to see that. And toolkits, well, people, a bit of a mixed bag, really. Some people have used toolkits before, but some people haven't. But in terms of my active travel toolkit, yes, people did support the concept of having this active toolkit, active travel toolkit. And 84% of people supported that concept. And actually 74% of respondents actually agreed with the scenarios that I had come up with. But in terms of more of the details of the toolkit, the intervention details, people thought that there could be a bit more detail there, a follow-up guide, some more examples for the interventions, and actually, you know, setting out the potential impact of the interventions, such as quantifiable benefits, potential carbon emission savings, and so on. But also another thing that people thought there could be some improvement on was the toolkit layout, and the accessibility side of things to use in the toolkit. So just very quick conclusion in terms of going back to my objectives. So it was clear that this STEEP framework showed that there was the key drivers of uncertainty throughout the different elements of the framework. And that uncertainty is experienced across all these factors. And the top three most uncertain variables are political agenda, travel demand, and public interest. And just like a real life example, that is still the case now. And it's a lot of my research kind of links to the COVID-19 pandemic, but now we have, the increase in cost of living crisis. And a personal example is I'm trying to change my mortgage, and thanks to the political situation at the moment, mortgage rates have increased. That's then caused me to have higher cost of living, and now I'm considering whether I go to work as much via the train, and perhaps work from home more. So even now there's still all this uncertainty with regards to participation, whether it's in active travel or public transport. But the second objective is all about how we can remain flexible to change. And I think the scenario development process really does allow you to adapt. You can add more scenarios by having more axes. And the toolkit itself, you can just add more interventions, or add your more scenarios, and ultimately create just a larger pool of interventions. And how can toolkits help transport planners plan? Well, from the survey results, I think that people do feel that toolkits are worth having as part of the decision-making process. And finally, in terms of further research, I think, as per my respondents to the survey said, more examples would be really good. And I'd like to actually add in some costs and impacts, benefits, and actually how you implement these interventions. I think it would be important to actually validate the interventions that I've got within the toolkit, and perhaps actually using one of the other toolkits as a way of testing them. And I'm actually really keen in creating the toolkit into a bit of an interactive platform. So you'd be able to kind of just answer some questions on a website, and it will just come up with an output of all the interventions that would suit that particular scenario that you've selected. But yeah, that's it from me. So thanks for listening.
Lucy, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm always excited and intrigued to see when everybody has the same question, all the different directions they go in. So that's what I love about the bursary competition. I just think it's fascinating. I think particularly something that really resonated with me from your presentation was those variables that you talked about. You know, well, today's another example, isn't it, about how the high reams of high government can have an effect on the things that we're trying to do within local authorities and within local areas to make sure that people have the opportunity to travel actively. You almost can't pull those apart, can you? So yeah, we're back to that, aren't we? There's just nothing to pull it apart, really. So you've had a brief insight into the question I'm going to ask next. So I just wanted to ask you about how you found the bursary process.
I thought it was great. Yeah, I've never done anything like this before. So it was a really good opportunity. As Julia said, I've kind of met a lot more people as part of the process, and my mentor. And yeah, you know, lots more going on LinkedIn. I think, yeah, networking opportunities are great. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
I just want to promise the audience that I didn't prime the presenters with these questions tonight. They didn't know this. They're all saying such lovely positive things about the bursary competition. So thank you, Lucy and Julia, so far. And then again, to ask you if anybody was considering entering, if you've got any words of wisdom to share with them.
Probably plan ahead, and structure of your paper is key. But yeah, like, start off with an ideas session, because you might have a thought, like a way you want to go from the start, but as you start researching, you might be steered in a different direction. So be open and kind of, yeah, have a brainstorming session of ideas that you might have, and just don't just focus on one thing from the start. Be open.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And again, I'm sure that if we were in a real room, you know, not on this virtual situation, the applause would be coming now. So just enjoy that and thank you. And we'll come back to you in a bit, Lucy. Thanks so much. So last but not least, I've got Liani. How are you? You there?
Yeah, hello. Hi, everyone. Yeah, hopefully they don't kick me out of the office this time. They promised me they wouldn't, so I'm trusting them.
You'll have to keep presenting whatever happens. So this will be fun. So the floor is yours. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll just share my screen now. Yeah, so hopefully that's coming across.
We can see your screen.
Perfect.
So there you go.
Wonderful. So, hello everyone. My name is Liani, and I'm going to be presenting on this spin that I took on the scenario planning prompt that we received when we developed these pieces of research. My paper was titled Mitigation, Adaptation, and Scenario Planning for the Development of Anti-Fragile Transport Systems. And I know it's a bit of a mouthful, so hopefully by the end of this presentation, you have an understanding or a rough understanding of what I meant, and then we can call it a success. So just a bit of background on where I started to approach this question of scenario planning was, we as transport planners, we are constantly faced by this challenge of looking into the future. So what to do? So we try to divide a little bit and to use methodologies and break down the complexity of the challenge. So and to navigate this uncertainty. So the first thing that I did was, what can we take as granted, given that there's a lot of uncertainty in the future? And then I said, the one thing that we know that is going to happen, because it's proved by science and there are so many papers out there, it's climate change. So I was taking climate change as our baseline. And then it wasn't, once I started reading a bit more into that, and it was coming across quite connected with this notion of system interconnectedness. So basically what it means is that there were some authors saying that because of the increasing interconnectedness between caused by globalization, by the digital technologies, by sector interconnectedness as well, that we are in a period in which black swan event, what was once considered black swan events, are going to become more and more common. So within that, we need to look both at mitigation and adaptation, because it's not only enough to reduce our emissions. We know that there are changes upcoming, so we also need to look at how we can adapt our transport systems for that. And then we need to look at immediate responses to shocks, but at the same time not losing the focus on the long-term strategizing. So within this huge context of uncertainty and complexity, scenario planning is a tool that can help us navigate. So taking that as a baseline, I started approaching this research question by looking at governance approaches and responses to shocks. And more specifically, I was looking at the most recent shock at the time, that was the pandemic. And I decided to look at two different, quite different governance approaches. So I looked at governance approaches here in the UK and at governance approaches in Peru. For that, I thought that looking at the diversity of sources was key in order to get a full picture, because what you could get from data would only tell you one side of the full picture. Then I was also looking at this is basically trying to summarize the different sources that I use. I looked at data from ministries and government departments, at international organizations. I looked at what was being published by independent research. I conducted quite a lot of interviews, but again, within these interviews, I try to look for people or for transport practitioners that would come from a variety of backgrounds and from a variety of sectors, looking at data and interviews with transport authorities as well. And then I use all of this data and all the analysis to develop these scenarios and finalize with some recommendations that I'll share with you in a moment. Going into the analysis, as I was mentioning, I was looking at two things. I was looking at governance approaches and responses to the pandemic. So for governance approaches, I was looking at the UK and Peru as very contrasting systems of governance in a way. So in the UK, we have this very strong long-standing planning tradition, and we have been quite good at developing frameworks and some sort of organized way of directing our transport operations. Whilst in Peru, the approach is a lot more devolved, and it's a bit of a policy there. It's quite open, and almost everyone is virtually able to offer a transport service as long as they don't transport people in two-wheelers. They are quite particular against that, but otherwise it is characterized by a context in which we don't really have such strong frameworks. Our first national policy for transport was in 2019, so it is a country that is still trying to integrate their different offers in transport. And then looking at responses to the pandemic and how these different countries responded based on these very particular governance systems that they have in place. Even though, as I was mentioning, they are organized quite differently. There were a few themes that were coming across quite consistently. The first one that I could find was I titled it "The Real Value of Transport," which was that when COVID hit and public transport was not as financially stable as it would have usually been. Basically, it was not being able to be funded much by user charges only. It's that we started seeing a lot of subsidies coming in from central government agencies, and then it kind of led to our thinking in what is it that where is it that we place our value in transport, and is it always economic value that we are trying to capture, or was it that during the pandemic we were actually trying to see how we can actually mobilize key workers and people that actually need to travel, and what is the value that we put on travel. Then the next one was the rationale behind the schemes, which was that during the pandemic, as soon as it hit as well, there was suddenly some rescue funds that became available in both countries, and some of the things that the professionals that I interviewed, and that was quite consistent between both countries as well, was that usually these funds would tend to go to the local authorities or to the operators that already had plans in place, and that already had something that could be quickly deployed. The one risk that was coming out from this was when these plans that were developed pre-pandemic were not really adapted to the evolving conditions, or they were reflecting or some sort of reactive plans to what was happening before, and not really considering what was the potential on what could happen into the future. So very reactive and not taking a proactive approach to shaping that future that we would like to see. And then the next one was on articulating the vision, and this was something quite interesting, and how local authorities were conveying these plans to the communities, but as well to central government. So I thought I looked at the communications aspects of things on this theme. And then it was also looking at capacities at the local level, and how, again, funds would tend to go to local authorities or to areas in which there was the capacity to convey those visions and to make the business case for it. And then the last one was how each country was dealing with new players and the potential or not for new players to arise and to cover those transport demands that were not being covered. So, for example, here in the UK, we saw that the rise of e-scooters, that were something that before was having some sort of some more obstacles in a way, or was not as easily deployed, but the pandemic in a way accelerated. In Peru, actually, what happened was quite interesting. It was, again, the rise of these small transport providers that were coming in to fill in those transport gaps. I remember seeing an interview among the people that I interviewed, and that they were mentioning how even during the pandemic, it was in one of these peripheral areas when people live in a bit more locally, and that people started realizing that there were some trips that were not being catered for. For example, there was this person saying that, yes, I realized during the pandemic that there was no way of people getting to the local market. So I started a taxi business just to cover that that opportunity, because I was unemployed. So I started doing a taxi business. So it was quite interesting to see these very reactive responses to transport, to the transport need. Having that into account, I started looking at scenario planning, and I started looking at 2 axes of uncertainty. The 2 axes of uncertainty were informed by these previous analyses. So on governance approaches, on one end, I put some more centralized management approaches, and on the other end, I put local agency. And in terms of responses to shocks, I borrowed a concept from risk management literature, which is the fragility concept. So in risk management, a system can be considered a fragile system when it hates disorder and when it always tries to return to a normal condition. But then if we consider the baseline that we were parting from, that it might be that in the future we see this once considered black swan events as the new normal and volatility as our new normal because of all this, or because of climate change and global interconnectedness and system interconnectedness, then we would need to look at systems that can actually embrace risks and can embrace volatility and that thrive within those. So in risk management literature, that's anti-fragility, and in anti-fragile systems, what you have is systems that embrace convex exposures to risks, that is, risks in which you have large potential for gains and a smaller potential for errors, but still a potential for error. And that allows you to build on cumulative innovation, but at the same time, and also post-traumatic growth. So looking at these 2 axes of uncertainty, I started looking at, okay, what would the different scenarios be if I started pushing it towards the edges of these axes. So the first one that I developed was local subsistence, which is in a scenario that is the key driver is everyday adaptation to shocks. So, and I developed a few indicators here that can illustrate a bit better what I meant by each scenario and how would they kind of score against these different criteria. So in local subsistence, you would have everyday adaptation to shocks. So you would potentially have a bit less in terms of social equity, because you would have this very disjointed approach to transport challenges and to wider societal challenges. Economic growth, again, you don't have much scope for cumulative innovation. Rapid urbanization, quite big. Political leadership, again, quite little, because it is a very disjointed approach. And innovation, there is the scope for very quick innovation and very quick deployment of initiatives, but again, you cannot really build on previous innovations, because it is an environment in which you have transport providers constantly entering and exiting the transport ecosystem. So the next one that I looked at is centralized investment, which again, it's towards the fragility end of the spectrum, but on the other hand, is a bit more central managed. So the key driver for that one was economic growth and city competitivity. So on that one, again, you don't score very highly on social equity, because all your resources go towards one specific pole of point of investment. Economic growth is quite high on that specific targeted area that you want to invest, or that specific route, or urban center. And then urbanization, you see a lot of it. You see very high urbanization, this specific point in which you are targeting all your resources. Political leadership, again, very high, because of the very centrally managed nature of this scenario. And on innovation, you don't see that much. It's there is going to be innovation artificially created on these on these very particular poles of investment, but there's not much scope to have this very localized innovation. So there's just so much that you can go on that aspect. And again, there's not much resilience on this system, because the moment something happens on that pole in which you had put all your resources, then you don't really have anything else to sustain those transport systems. And the next one that I looked at is equitable development. That looks a bit more considers a bit, the key driver is polycentric development, so development that it's, so there is a lot of central intervention in ensuring development, but it is not all just focused on one specific area. So in terms of social equity, it scores a lot higher, economic growth against a lot higher, rapid urbanization, it's a bit more distributed. It's not urbanization centered in just one particular place, political leadership quite high, and innovation, this one is quite interesting, it scores quite high because by having a more localized approach to innovation, then you are more able to share resources if the appropriate knowledge sharing systems are put in place. And then on the last one that I explored was healthy communities, in which the key driver is people's health and well-being, so not economic drivers in particular. So social equity is put quite at the forefront of these, so it scores quite highly. Economic growth, you do see some of it because it's a key enabler of prosperity, but not the only one. And then rapid urbanization is not that necessary, because if you are able to ensure these appropriate levels of accessibility to be distributed across different places, then you do not need to have one specific pole of rapid urbanization. Political leadership, this one goes more towards community leadership and community initiatives taken at the forefront. And innovation, there is a scope for innovation, but it really, really depends on how these resources are shared and communicated so that it can build on cumulative innovation. So I think something that I would like to emphasize here about these developments, about these scenarios that I just described, and was that for each scenarios, what I was trying to do was to identify key opportunities and challenges. And the reason why I developed these very, very polarized scenarios is to help illustrate what could be these different pathways of how a future could look like. And then I think the key with scenario planning is that it is a useful tool that can help us prioritize actions when we are faced with uncertainty. But more than that, it can actually help us take a proactive approach and actively influence our trajectory away from the less desirable futures and towards those futures that we would like to see based on the specific goals that we set. So just looking at all that, some final recommendations that came out from this paper, and I call it a 7-point list, were the following. First of all, to take a strategic goal, and this is a bit associated to what I was mentioning earlier. Once we have that strategic goal, that outcome that we want to achieve, then there is where scenario planning can help us understand what would be the key challenges and opportunities across these different scenarios and how we can actually start being more proactive to influence our trajectory. Then the second one is to take a network approach to understand, as I think we're all very aware as transport planners, that it's not one mode that can solve everything. But again, there is always risks there are challenges on how we can ensure that cross collaboration. But yeah, I think it's the moment we start looking more at the strategic goal rather than a mode defined solution is when we can start building that resilience to the network. Then the third one is to plan in advance, because as we saw with the pandemic and other shocks, it is easier to quickly react and to adapt our plans once there's something in place. Otherwise, we will just be rushing our responses. Then the fourth one is to be quick to adapt, but at the same time to ensure that these plans that we are adapting, once we see a shock, or that come to make sure that they are context sensitive and that they are still relevant to the evolving conditions. And then the fifth one is to build in the local capacity and the capacity to convey the wider benefits and how we are following that strategic goal. the sixth one is to ensure political support. And I think something quite interesting about this risk management literature vocabulary that I was mentioning, and of fragility and anti-fragility, is that taking risks are a part of that, and that we shouldn't be so afraid of failure, as long as this is controlled failure, because only from that failure is that we can continue on this cumulative innovation and logic of post-traumatic growth. And then, yeah, I think that relates quite nicely to the last one, that it's to make room for mistake. And yeah, I think the one that summarizes everything is that we need to continue engaging in more scenario planning. I know that we, like, as transport learners, we try to reduce all risks and uncertainty as much as possible, but we should always be open to uncertainty. I think the only thing that we know is that anything that we plan for into 50 years is that it's probably not going to look like the plans that we are making now. So scenario planning, it's a key tool to help us navigate that uncertainty. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating presentation, and another fascinating presentation this evening. I really appreciate that. And your 7-point list at the end was fascinating. It covers pretty much everything, doesn't it? Just showing us how fragile everything is and how we can't plan for anything, really. So I'm going to ask you the same questions that I asked the others. How did you find the bursary experience?
Yeah, sorry for I was struggling to mute myself, but but yeah. So yeah, no, I completely agree, and I don't want to sound too philosophical, but I think even though there is a lot of uncertainty out there, we still need to bring it back home, and that's why scenario planning was so important. So following from that, I do believe that it was great to have engaged in this process of researching this topic that it's so important. The research process was a challenging one, but nonetheless a very exciting one. And I think I agree with the other Bursarians. It was great in terms of connecting with such interesting people from so many different backgrounds that you wouldn't have normally haven't normally spoken with. And yeah, I think it's great to present this paper again, and I think it's good as well to be presenting it, so that it's not a piece of knowledge that it just stays there, but it's more an active and a piece of knowledge that is alive. And the more we socialize this type of research, the more perspective we can get, the more we can continue building on the conversation.
Fantastic answer. And again, have you got any words of wisdom that you'd like to offer anybody who might be, who's writing their paper at the moment, or might be thinking of entering another year?
Yeah, definitely. If you haven't entered the competition, that do in the future. It is a great opportunity. If you are already in the competition and you have already have your paper, your abstract accepted, then try to conduct interviews. It's always very great to hear from other people. Like literature reviews, yes, there is so much that you can learn, but there's something else about not having a specific agenda and doing something that is a bit separate from your everyday work, but at the same time that is related, because in that sense you're able to approach things with a lot more openness, I would say. So it is a great opportunity in that sense.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask Lucy and Julia to put their cameras back on so that we can have a bit of a discussion. We've got some questions in the chat, but I'm just going to draw attention to the people who are in the audience tonight. So we've launched our bursary competition for 2022. We have 5 finalists, and they're going to be tackling the question that perhaps is another one in the forefront of all our minds. Buses, how do we ensure they take their rightful place as key players in the UK's public transport network? So we're asking what role buses can take in tackling the current challenges of post-COVID recovery, cost of living crisis, climate crisis and inequality. So I'm looking forward to seeing how we deal with bosses this year. So yeah, look out for those. And in the same way as they have been this year, the papers in due course will be published on the Transport Planning Society website. So look out for posts about that. And then hopefully we'll have another session like this next year. So Lucy and Julia, welcome back. Thank you all three of you so much for such interesting presentations this evening. I'm going to try and manage some kind of discussion here. We've got some questions in the chat which I'm going to try and put to each of you, if that's okay with everybody, and we'll just have a bit of a discussion about your papers. But thank you again so much. So Belinda, thank you so much for your questions. So she's put in the chat that she's a local councillor who's constantly frustrated by risk aversion from fellow politicians. We have to learn to take risks and make mistakes and act rapidly when necessary. So I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about how we might engage with politicians, because we need leadership in all of this, don't we? So have you got any views on how we might engage with that kind of sector in order to make them feel more involved in this, I suppose? Don't know if anybody wants to go first, or I'll have to pick. That's always horrible.
I guess I could say something. Because I work in public sector, I work quite closely with politicians, the members that we have, and Oxfordshire is a two-tier authority. So not only am I dealing with my members in the county council, but also the district members within whichever district I'm also working, doing the project on. But engagement is absolutely key. And whenever I carry out engagement, I always kind of do stakeholder mapping. So making sure you are telling the right people the right information and trying to get, try and identify what you want to hear back from those particular stakeholders. So in terms of getting them more involved in scenario planning and hearing this, I think I would probably try and do some kind of workshop or something, and get them more like involved in the process, like have someone present about scenario planning and then like get them to do an exercise or an activity so they can actually try and apply it to what they're doing. And whether they, it could be something where it's like, I don't know if there is anything where members from across other local authorities may meet at some kind of session or something, or whether they just stick within their local authorities, but something where you might meet other members, because there's lots of opportunity for members to actually share experiences from across different organizations, really. So that's kind of my ramble of an opinion. Yeah.
I think that's really useful, Lucy. So thank you for that. Julia, I just wondered if you had any views on how we might influence local politicians getting involved in the kind of sustainable leisure travel. That's because of a different aspect of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think hopefully with the Proactive Travel England, who have obviously finally appeared this year, that is a right step in a good step in the right direction in terms of engaging with kind of policy background on leisure travel. Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, obviously, because I think we're still, as I said in my presentation, focusing on the commuter. And I mean, I've personally emailed my local councillors about many issues, and they always say, we're just waiting kind of for the bigger council to kind of do something about it. But I, as a consultant, I actually work for the bigger council, and I know it's not on their agenda at the moment. So I think it's a tricky one when people are still focusing so much on the commuting. And maybe just these kind of, if we demonstrate good pilot schemes and successful cases, then that is a good catalyst for pop off my screen.
That's right.
A good catalyst for kind of encouraging that shift.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that there might be kind of language issue. I work for a local authority as well, and when I've spoken with Active Travel England, I've kind of emphasised this need for making sure we're all talking about the same things. So one of my big bugbears is that we make travel way too complicated for people. So the side example might be, if you haven't caught a bus for a very long time, it's very difficult to work out how to do that, because you need to know how to read a bus timetable, which is okay for some of us, but if you haven't read one, it's quite complicated. Is the real-time information, which we may or may not have, really real-time information, or is it just a kind of flash up of the timetable? How do I buy my ticket? Do I buy it on the bus before I get on the bus, on and out? I don't know. It's all made very complicated, isn't it? It's almost like we're trying to stop people travelling sustainably, and we've got to make sure that language is right, but also working with counsellors to make sure that they're not caught out. It's we don't want them to be embarrassed and asked for something that they don't quite understand. So working with them to make sure that kind of we're all speaking the same language about what we want to get, and then they know what their electorate is asking them for, but we know as professionals are able to help them kind of understand what the options are. So I think there's kind of some language work that needs to be done there in all respects in terms of this. But yeah, really, really useful. I'm also going to just stick with you, Julia, if that's all right, for a second.
I need to go grab my charger. My laptop is flashing at me.
Okay, no problem.
90
okay,
seconds.
Don't worry.
Oh, you're on mute, Joe.
It's all going well, isn't it? The next 2 minutes. Anyway, I'll start again. Just while waiting for Julia to come back, I was going to ask you all about your kind of thoughts about non-commuter travel, about how we might encourage people to do that. So Leonie, if I could start with you, have you got any ideas about how we can encourage more people to think about the way they travel, perhaps not in their commuter trips, but perhaps in their leisure and spare time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that, I mean, when we were doing this research, it was still very COVID time. So we were like planning to the future, how the future of like the post-pandemic future is going to look like. I think we're coming, even though we're having a bit of another wave, I think we're now in a moment in which it seems like things have in a way returned back to normal, but have they really? And was it the normal as before? So I think something the key that we have seen is this redefinition of travel, of trips, and the way we travel. So a lot more local, like people have a lot of people have relocated, a lot of people have started new working arrangements as well. Like this has been influenced by many things, companies as well, adopting more flexible policies. Occupancy rates at offices are not like as we used to take before, around 85% that we used to take occupancy rates in London. Now we see a lot lower per day, but that also allows for other types of trips, more local trips, which again bring a lot of opportunities for more mixed use planning. And it's again in this territory in which transport starts relating with planning and with one of my very, very deep aspects of interest, urban design and landscape. And because at the same time, when we try to encourage trips that are not for commuting, it's not that we're looking from A to B, but also how to make those trips interesting. And I think when we're talking about behavioral change, because I think it's part of, and I take it as my baseline, I don't know if it's too ambitious to do, but that we are all in this room are trying to strive to encourage more sustainable travel. And if we want to do so, we're not going to achieve that wider behavioral change and that step change in behavioral change that we need just by penalizing people and by telling them, oh, you have to sacrifice something in order to something in order to reach decarbonization goals and things like that, because people don't like losing in a way. So you need to make it exciting and start approaching behavioral change and this embracing these other types of trips in a very positive way. So how we can make traveling an enjoyable activity? How can we unlock other things as part of that? I don't know, either accessing community services or like accessing nature, health and well-being, just that feeling of connection. There is a lot of things that can be associated to traveling, and where as transport planners could be a bit better at integrating with other disciplines as well. So I think it's not something that we're going to solve here in a room of just transport planners, but yeah, it's good that we're having this conversation, and that it's definitely a great opportunity to see this travel patterns be redefined.
That's a good almost piece of homework for everybody to go and talk to somebody that was within their discipline. So we're not just an echo chamber, isn't it? So thank you for that. That's useful. Lucy, have you got any thoughts on this about how we might encourage active travel outside of the commute?
I think like incentivizing people, because I know like there's this better points thing where you kind of earn points and you can get like rewards and stuff for like your active travel, sustainable travel. And I think like, yeah, I just think that people would travel more outside of like commuting if there was something in it for them. Because we can tell people like as many times as we want that, oh yeah, there's all these benefits to active travel and sustainable travel, like health benefits, air quality and so on, but like to actually get them to do it, I think they need something to push them in that direction, and that could be anything. Like I've just got myself an e-bike on the cycle to work scheme, so I'm like really chuffed about trying to like save money on fuel, because now I've noticed the fuel prices are going up again. So like that's almost an incentive to me, because you know I can't afford to pay for this bike like outright. So at least a cycle to work scheme, I'm paying it each month. So that's like an incentive in some way. And I'm kind of like incentivizing myself by I'll ride my bike more. And I specifically got an e-bike because I thought, oh, I do like cycle, but more for like leisure. But I thought, oh, if I got e-bike option, I might go further, and you know, I might actually like cut out some of my car journeys. But there's other ways of incentivizing too. You know, like local authorities could, for example, give out trial doing like free bus passes for like a week or something to try and get people to change their like travel behaviors, and then like perhaps change like their routines, because people are like fixed to doing a certain routine. You know, I know we're talking about like non-commuting, but even like school travel, you know, parents drop off their kids, a lot of them unfortunately, in the car, and you think, could you try doing something different? And yeah, like you mentioned before, Joe, like active travel might work for some people but might not work for everyone, and I completely agree with that. But yeah, there's just, I think they're incentivizing people, it could be a good option of trying to get more people involved in sustainable travel, active travel outside of commuting.
It's often about the hook, isn't it, that's for you. So I have always been kind of an active travel person. I've always liked walking everywhere, but I only got a bike when the tram works in Nottingham got so bad that I couldn't get anywhere on time by getting the bus. So I bought a bike, and that's really the only way I can do everything I want to do now, is because I know how long it takes me on my bike. So it's kind of, and then I got a Brompton, and that, you know, like you will find with your electric bike, that kind of brings in conversations because people want to talk to you about it. So it's kind of nice. But the hook for me, and the hook probably for many people, isn't just because it's the right thing to do. It's because I want, you know, you want to save money, or you want to get somewhere quicker, or you just don't like going to the gym, which is another of my issues. And Julia, do you want to come in? Have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually I saw in the chat someone's question after my presentation was kind of also about how to widen the appeal to kind of a broader audience. And I think that is an interesting point. Obviously, I can only speak for one kind of group, which is women. There aren't as many women leisure cyclists as men. And obviously there's further minorities that I don't belong to, and I obviously am in a reasonably privileged group as a within women to like do leisure cycling. But most of my friends are scared of leisure cycling, but I've brought them all on trips with me, and then they love it, and then they do it independently. And I think that's kind of a big gap to bridge amongst lots of groups. People might not even know they're going to love it because they've never tried it, and that's why lockdown was so great in a way, because there was no traffic on the streets and so many people took to cycling. And in some ways we kind of need to enable that environment a bit more, and whether that's by providing more segregated kind of off-road routes that people can feel confident and learn to cycle on, because most people I know I only picked up cycling 4 years ago when I moved to Cambridge. I didn't cycle. I used to be someone who said, I don't know why the cyclists like cycle in the middle of the road, why aren't they on like the curb line? And then I moved to Cambridge and like absolutely fell in love with it. And I just think there needs to be something to kind of be that catalyst to get people to fall in love with it, because obviously it's not for everyone. Not everyone can cycle, but I think there's going to be a massive group of people who can cycle and they just don't know it yet. And we need to provide kind of the right infrastructure or kind of activities available for them to kind of have a go, basically. Sorry, that was a bit rambly.
No, that's good. I think it's good. And I think if people have a good experience, then they want to do it again. So I think that's interesting, what you're saying about getting your friends to have a go at it, because that does kind of, and it's a social thing as well, isn't it? I don't seem to be able to leave my house on my bike and cycle anywhere without seeing somebody else I know, which I'm not sure happens with any other form of transport apart from walking.
It is social. Yeah. You always stop and chat to people, and I've done quite a few kind of long distance rides, and you wouldn't, if you went to a motorway service station, you wouldn't just spark up a conversation with the person in the car next to you. But for some reason, you're all out on your bikes, or when you're just walking and cycling, you always do.
And Lucy, you'll find this with your electric bike. Lots of people want to ask you questions, I'm sure. So, okay. So I'm just conscious of the time, and I'm going to just bring us back to the initial thing that we were here to talk about this evening. So we were going to talk about scenario planning. How can transport planners best plan for the new normal? So I'm going to go to each of our panelists and ask them if they've got one thing that they think that transport planners could do to ensure that we're planning for the new normal. So perhaps we'll go in the order that we went in with the presentation. So Julia, if I come back to you first, have you got one or two things that you think transport planners could do?
I think from my presentation, actually one of the most important things is data capture. I'm constantly frustrated as a transport planner that even though these really great schemes exist, that data hasn't been captured or isn't publicly available for other professionals to use, and it's just a massive, I think, hole in. Some people do really great things and we can't learn from that, and we can't use that, and same with kind of travel planning. It's so frustrating as a transport planner that I do these travel plans for people, and then it's a few years down the line and where's their travel survey? They're not adhering to it, and it's really frustrating. And I think in order to kind of move forward the new normal, it's going to be really good to capture kind of what's currently there, and then we can actually target kind of schemes or responses to that new normal, whatever it is, by using kind of baseline.
Oh, that is music to my ears. That conversation that we have to have at the start of every scheme about monitoring and evaluation and putting some budget to it. I just, yeah. Thank you so much, Julia. Lucy, the same question to you. Have you got any thoughts about the one or two things that transport planners could do to make sure we're planning for the new normal?
Well, I was thinking about my personal experience having worked in local authority, and currently, because I relatively recently joined Oxfordshire, and the people that I've met, they keep wanting to do these kind of walk and talks and meet with other councils and go to see certain schemes, and I've never done anything like that before, and whenever I go, I'm always learning something new about what someone else has done, and then I can take it back to use as part of my job, whether it's on a scheme or what. And I think even doing that, even if you're not going to visit these places to see other schemes for your benefit, for your work, it's actually doing it anyway will actually help you as a transport planner kind of realize what else is out there you might not have thought of doing a certain thing a certain way. But yeah, it's just kind of case study examples. I think that's actually important, so you can see it might work somewhere, it might not work somewhere else, or you might get some good ideas from one case study and then you might adapt it to yours. So yeah, I think that's quite an important thing. And in my toolkit, I made reference to in the interventions that I put forward, all these different case studies of where I considered an intervention had been successfully implemented, but someone might pick that intervention, and it might not work for them, but it might work for someone else, depending on loads of different factors, location, like money they've got available, and political support and all sorts of things like that. So I don't know, yeah, just all about case studies and kind of having that like awareness of what else you could do.
I think that's really, really useful. Thanks so much, Lucy. Appreciate that thought. And Liani, have you got any thoughts on what transport planners could do to, one or two things that we could go and do?
Yeah, well, I also have 7 points list, but I'm not going to repeat all those. So if it was just one thing, I would say use scenario planning as a tool to influence trajectory rather than just relying on one specific future. So I think as transport planners, we try to be we can be a bit risk averse in some ways. We try to ensure that we are planning for robustness, but maybe robustness is not the word that we should be using, because that also tries to eliminate risks. And the truth is that there is huge uncertainty out there in what future travel behaviors could look, and not only risks, but also huge opportunities. And I think sometimes we can diminish the potential for those. I'll just give a quick example. For example, in terms of active travel, when we're trying to, if we want to predict future use based on previous use, then we're not going to reach the targets that we have set, or we might just achieve those targets, but why not go beyond? So I think something quite interesting that happened in Peru was that during the pandemic, people were actually locked in their houses pretty badly. Like the lockdown was really, really bad. But at the same time, we were quite lucky in the sense that we have a very interesting political alignment in which politicians at different levels have the same decarbonization agenda, which helped quite a lot to fast forward a lot of schemes that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So when people came back into the streets, there was all this suite of pop-up cycle infrastructure, and that otherwise people would have said, no, where are you taking my parking away? Like no one cycles. But because the infrastructure was there, people started to use it. And that's the thing, normally when we look at participation or when we look at data, we look at what has been there before, but we don't open that much the room for exploration or to include those users that have not been included in the past. So at the time, so what happened there was that we were able to see that representation from users that were not cyclists before. So cycling rates more than doubled, and they have stayed that way just because we had that push going forward, and just because we overrule otherwise assumptions that otherwise would have been outdated anyways. So I think sometimes we need to be a bit less, we need to use data, of course, to help inform our future thinking, but we should not take it as the only possible future.
Really, really important points. I can't believe it. We're running out of time. I think I could chat to you all for hours about this. It's such a fascinating topic, but I am going to have to draw this evening to a conclusion. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to our 3 presenters. The presentations have been fantastic and just as amazing as I remember them being. But thank you for entering the bursary competition, and thank you for going along with all the things that we've asked you to do, like presenting this evening. I want to say thank you to the audience for coming and for joining in with the conversation. And hopefully there's lots more to think about. And perhaps when we're all together in person again, we'll be able to carry on this discussion. And then I also want to thank PTRC and Brogan, who's been there in the background making everything work for us. So thank you once again. And I am sure if we were in a room all together, everybody would be clapping now, and there would be lots of networking on, because everybody will want to talk to you about your research. So if you get a chance, please do have a look at the research on the website. And I'll say thank you and good evening, everybody. Thank you very much.